All right, should we get going, Rolf?
Yeah, are you seeing my my screen?
I am, yes.
Okay. Sure. Everybody is hearing me okay. Welcome to this training session, Introduction to the B3 Guidelines for the Small Buildings. I'm Rolf Jacobson. I work with Pat at the CSBR on the B3 Guidelines, along with Liz Kutschke, and we're all on the webinar this morning. We've got 90 minutes scheduled, and we're going to kind of take you through some background on why the small buildings method was developed, how that, I should say, dovetails or integrates with the SB 2030 small building method, which some of you may be familiar with. And then kind of go into more details on the guidelines themselves. First with a kind of general overview through the whole thing, and then a deep dive on some specific guidelines that we thought would be helpful to discuss in greater detail. Maybe they had particular changes that we want to highlight. Finally, we'll have time for questions at the end, although we're also going to be, if you have questions during these deep dive sections, please feel free to enter those in the chat as well, and we can respond at the end of each one of those sections. So we will be posting this webinar, a recording of this webinar on the training page. Just to let you know, so it will be available later. And for those of you that need AA credits, please just enter your AA number into the chat, and Liz will be recording those, and we can get the credit information out to you.
We also did pick up when you registered your AIA number. So some of those we have that already when you filled that out in your registration link. But if you missed that, please send us your AIA in the chat.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, and the attendees will be muted. So you'll have to enter. If you have questions, please use the chat function. Okay. So I'm going to kick it off with a kind of an introduction to the B3 Guidelines Small Building Method. And we have been hearing for a long time from project teams and owners that the full suite of guidelines were, shall we say, challenging to meet with the smaller budgets and kind of compressed timelines of small projects. So we decided to try and tackle that with the small buildings method and significantly decrease the costs and kind of administration for these projects. And we also wanted to take that opportunity to kind of refocus many of the guidelines on those guidelines that perhaps have a higher impact to burden ratio, more bang for the buck, and while retaining as many of the kind of environmental and IEQ benefits of the full set of guidelines as possible.
And I'd also jump in to note that we also have some areas where we've got some more specific legislative direction that we've needed to hold on to in terms of which guideline areas we've been asked to focus on.
Yeah, we can bring some of those up as we go. So just generally, first, I know Pat will be diving into this in greater detail later, but just generally, the small buildings method for the B3 guidelines will be applicable for buildings less than or equal to 20,000 gross conditioned square feet. And that was chosen because it aligns with the existing SB 2030 small buildings method, as well as many of the other programs that are out there already that such as the EDA programs or the ASHRAE design guide. So it seemed to be a number that people had honed in on, and we followed suit there. there are some interesting questions about what counts as conditioned square footage or gross conditioned square footage, which Pat is going to dive into a little bit later. Also, just to note that the renovation and addition projects less than 20,000 square foot also follow this approach. And a reminder that pure renovations less than 10,000 square foot have not been required and will not be required to participate in the B3 or SB 2030 program. So if you're under that threshold, of course, none of this would apply. Okay, just quickly, I mean, one of the first things we did was just run through our project list and pull out the small buildings that have been coming through to get a handle on what types of buildings these were. So here's a list, kind of a snapshot. We were seeing maintenance and shop buildings, small offices, labs, libraries, school additions, camper cabins, really just a very wide variety of different building types. And in the future, we're expecting to see some more multifamily housing projects as increasingly cities like St. Paul are looking to follow these guidelines as well. So there's a very wide variety of building types, and we wanted to keep that in mind as we were developing these. Let's see. Also, I should just say that the process so far, I don't have a slide for this, but the process so far, we've held 2 small buildings kind of focus groups. So I know many of you attended those sessions, and we wanted to say thank you for doing that and providing input over email or at the sessions. We appreciated that quite a bit. So this has been kind of a team effort. We've been trying to follow the suggestions as much as possible from designers and owners of building teams out there. So keeping in mind many of those suggestions, we decided on an overall approach that really retained the existing guideline structure. We got responses that suggest, not to pursue a whole separate guideline, but rather build these into the existing structure to retain some of the familiarity and that had been developed over the years with the existing B3 guidelines. So we did that. The small buildings method will now exist more or less as a subset of guidelines. So many of the within the full guidelines, many of the credits remain, or the guidelines remain unchanged, but others you'll see have been removed, or they've had components, subsections, specific requirements modified or changed, such as submittal requirements. They might be altered a bit to reflect the goals that we discussed earlier. Inside the tracking tool, those guidelines will be turned on or off. In some cases, there will be some changes there, but in general, you'll see the same tracking tool as before.
I would make an overall note as well that this is a expansion of the different available paths the product teams can use to meet B3. But if there is a potentially more straightforward prescriptive approach that the design team wants to go with the existing or kind of legacy approach, that's still an option for them. This isn't this is not limiting the number of available options the design teams have to confirm that they're meeting the guidelines.
Right, great point, Pat. So, I mean, if you find that the new guidelines, the small building guidelines, are just too restrictive and you can't meet them, it doesn't make sense for your project, you can always go back to the full set of guidelines and look at the submittal requirements or the requirements for from the large building.
And it's just to note, it's not a unlike some versions we've had with the system where it's kind of an either or. if there's a small building pathway in one guideline, you can use that small building pathway, even if in another guideline you want to use the larger building approach. It is very guideline by guideline, provided that you're in the version 3.2 or later.
Right. Okay, so when we sat down to look at these guidelines, we developed kind of this rubric for evaluation, and we were looking at how impactful the guideline was, meaning does it result in meaningful changes for design teams and construction practices compared to the business as usual. We were also taking into account how much effort is required for compliance, again, noting that small buildings have smaller budgets, smaller design teams, and compressed schedules. So we wanted to try and reduce that effort as well as the expense. And also there were just some guidelines that weren't very appropriate for small buildings. So that's kind of the rubric that we used for evaluating. And we'll as we go through these guidelines, I hope that this, you can see how this rubric was used for the modifications. All right, I think Pat's gonna jump on now to talk about some timeline stuff and how the B3 small buildings method integrates with the SB 2030 small buildings method.
Yeah, you can tell they're my slides because they're just a wall of text. So this is a revision that we're putting forward to version 3.2. So Rolf mentioned that we wanted to take a crack at looking at the applicability of this for smaller buildings, and that occurred after we'd done kind of a full sweep from version 3.0, 3.1, 3.2 of the guidelines. We worked on different sections as we pushed out those different updates. So this is the coming around again to look at how to approach these for smaller projects. So this will be pushed out as a revision to version 3.2. We are not, because there's not an insignificant amount of effort required to modify prior versions of the guidelines, and we want to just take where we are and move forward. This is just that 3.2 modification. If project teams, if you have a smaller project that's in version 3.1 or 3.0, I've had some communications with design teams that have moved into version 3.2 to take access, to have access to this update. And that's an option for any project team that's in a prior version, because we let projects select and opt into a more recent version if they want. Tracking tool programming is underway. We're working out some of the details on how guidelines will be modified, deactivated, and how project teams will see the onboarding of their projects. I'm hoping to have that fully live in April, assuming that there's no large technical hiccups. Unfortunately, it's been a little bit delayed from where I was hoping, which was this month, but you'll still see that coming. In the meantime, my recommendation for project teams is to, once they're in version 3.2, is to take a look at where we are with the guideline revisions. And this is what we're seeing today is kind of the 99% done format of this, or 99% done version of this, to take that and use the provisional variances in the tool to note those areas that are likely to drop out, that are almost certainly to drop out in the when these revisions go live. Just wanted to note, Rolf, go back a slide. We're doing a pass first through the small buildings, and we will pick up a similar evaluation for the smaller site and water section. That's in much earlier phases. If you'd like to participate in those discussions, please reach out, let me know. And I can loop you into those small focus groups and the drafting and evaluation of where we could make accommodations for smaller sites. One of the reasons why we split that up was you have some small buildings on large sites, you have some large buildings on small sites. It seemed useful to categorize them separately. And then also slated as an upcoming revision that will also be pushed out as a revision to version 3.2 is the inclusion of some recommended guidelines on resilience. Those are likely to come in later as required guidelines, but in this revision to 3.2, we'll be noting them as recommendations. We have taken the approach of not adding additional requirements to a guidelines version. But we also, if we're either providing additional pathways or lowering a threshold, we feel like that's something that we can reasonably do for an existing ongoing version. So one note here on the relationship between the SB 2030 small building method and the B3 guidelines small building method is that they are somewhat distinct. Rolf mentioned that they dovetail. They use a similar square footage threshold, but there are subtle differences between the two. SB 2030 small building method, we've got an approach for that was built up in 2020 that's available for project teams. Unfortunately, I don't yet have that that well documented, but we do have the direction we can provide to design teams that want to access that. What this does is allow a small project to meet a prescriptive energy standard, do some on-site renewable evaluation, and then use that in connection with their energy standard tool outputs to find what bundle of stuff they need to bring to meet their SB 2030 target. But that SB 2030 small building method, we've had a version of that since 2013 or so. But that's really just related to the energy efficiency and renewable energy requirements for the project. It's the B3 guideline small building method that we're launching now really picks up all those other areas of the guidelines, your performance management, building related site and water requirements. So indoor water quality and bird safety for glazing, the atmospheric protection, so the non-energy related items from the energy and atmosphere section, including EV ready, including the renewable solar ready building, solar ready sites, and then those material and indoor environmental quality sections. And then, as I mentioned, we're looking to start the process of a similar update to the site and water section. And so that's the site water connections, that's site and water quality, soil, and vegetation. We sent out a draft version of this. I just wanted to flag those areas where this, what we're talking about today is somewhat different. There's not any major changes, excuse me. But just wanted to have this so folks can capture those items that might be subtly different. We've tweaked a couple of the qualifying thresholds in I1A and M2B. We re-added a few that were noted as potentially reasonable impact items that were not high burden, including the use of adjustable chairs and work station seating, universal design requirements, and mercury limits on lamps. And then we're also did some tweaking of how the acoustics guidelines work. Where we landed last time could be more easily met by using a subset of existing guideline rather than writing a new small building guideline. And so that got edited back. M2B, apologize for my typo here. M2B is required for the 5 most prevalent materials. That is missing from my slide, so. Okay, so the applicability, Rolf mentioned there's some subtlety to the definition of conditioned space. The intent is to capture those buildings that that have a large square footage of regularly occupied area, and to exempt those spaces that are used for storage and used for things like wastewater treatment plant process and that are not typical kind of highly occupied, highly energized spaces. But when you get into how to define that, we ended up using a combination of the regularly occupied spaces that we had existing, and then ASHRAE's a definition of indirectly conditioned or semi-heated. And so we're permitting the exclusion from this 20,000 square foot number that project teams will input. Those spaces that are not regularly occupied and which are indirectly conditioned or semi-heated, those that are not regularly occupied and used to enclose industrial or similar processes, and those that are used, those not regularly occupied spaces that are used providing inactive storage. And so this might make a difference for project teams looking between a maintenance shop and a cold storage, right? That cold storage doesn't have people in it. We're less interested in pushing on design teams to do a full sweep of indoor environmental quality issues on that because there's just not folks in that space. Also, the more smaller design teams work on those on some of those spaces, and more specialized design teams that are their wheelhouse is potentially looking at these industrial buildings or these kind of other building types. So that's the areas that can contribute to that can be excluded upon review from us for that 20,000 square feet. So if you have a question about a area that's that you'd like to exclude from calculation, please reach out and we can have that discussion. Also excluded here but not listed is this bottom row, which is unconditioned space. So we're really looking at 20,000 square feet of gross conditioned area minus those inactive storage minus that primarily industrial space. This table will pop up on our the newer version when it gets pushed out. I also hope to have the final document of this done in April. It'll go later this week to the copy editors, so it takes a pass through that before it gets pushed out. And then, so I mentioned this briefly, but I'll go in a little bit more into detail about what the SB 2030 small building method is. Again, there's two methods out there. They're named very similar, but they're somewhat discrete. B3 guideline small building method, the thing we're spending most of today on is that full sweep of indoor environmental quality, materials, process management, et cetera. SB 2030 is really just about this energy target setting. So we developed this process to reduce the need for energy simulation for small buildings to permit, essentially in lieu of a modeling approach, to permit a prescriptive set of efficiency measures to be established. The prior version of this timed out at the end of 2019 with the 2020 updates. In 2020, we updated the SB 2030 program to better take account for on-site versus off-site opportunities, understanding that as we move from a 70 to 80% better building, that we are bumping up against, in some project types, the limits of cost effectiveness. And so this new SB 2030 small building method aligns with that hierarchical approach of looking at on-site versus off-site resources for meeting your SB 2030 target. A couple questions in the chat will pop up. Oh, they're in the chat, not the Q&A. Oh, Rolf, can you go back a slide? I think I caught everything there.
Yeah, I think you did.
Oh, yep. So we updated this in 2020. But again, I'll put a blanket apology out for not having this write up available at the moment, but I'm more than happy to discuss what the different parts of this are with design teams. So this aligns with the hierarchical approach that got put forward with the 2020 SB 2030 updates, the broader ones. What this is looking at how to meet an SB 2030 target once we're hitting these more aggressive thresholds. We're now at 80% better. Energy target for an SB 2030 project is 80% better than a 2003 average building, our estimate of a 2003 average building. And so what project teams do as they're per the 2020 updates is look first at what available resources are on site, then look at what resources are available in their portfolio, and then look at what if renewable energy procurement, look into or procure renewable energy. And so they go between these two levels in the hierarchy to the limits of cost effectiveness. The bounds that our program works in are meet these more aggressive energy targets combined with have a cost effectiveness baked into the process that a project would use to meet that. And so, those two things we are meeting now by letting folks exhaust what opportunities they have on the site per what could be considered cost effective, then looking off-site if they've got off-site renewable energy development opportunities, and then looking at renewable energy procurement if they can't, if there's no opportunities in the first or second levels of the hierarchy. Ralph, you can go to the next slide. We use a simple payback to proxy a much more in-depth measure by measure evaluation of where cost effectiveness lands when considering some utility program style evaluations. And so for the first decade or so of the program, we used the cost effectiveness window of 15 years because the grid has improved somewhat in its carbon intensity. We now use a payback period of 12 years for that threshold of cost effectiveness. So a larger building going through the program that wanted to look at accessing this hierarchy of renewables would need to document that they're exhausting the site, that they are doing everything on the site, or at least meeting the same level of performance as a building that's using everything within that 12-year simple payback. Then they would be able to access the second and third levels of the hierarchy. For smaller buildings, we wanted to basically forego that process of back and forth of making sure that they're actually doing everything that they need to do on the site before stepping out of the site. We do that by letting them document that level with using a more aggressive than baseline prescriptive approach. And so the options that are available for project teams for commercial projects are ASHRAE 90.1 2019, the New Buildings Institute 40% stretch code, available ASHRAE, or the ASHRAE Advanced Energy Design Guide, the AEDG, the Zero Net Energy series, which currently they've got pushed out for small, medium offices and K through 12 school buildings, and then the International Green Construction Code. And all these are either directly or modifications of the ASHRAE 90.1 2019 standard. It seems to be the one that's most, the structure of which is most is best understood in the market. For residential projects, the baseline will be the DOE Zero Energy Ready Home program. So this is an option for project teams to document that they've hit the efficiency measures on the site. That's on top of that efficiency measures, they still need to look at the feasibility, the cost effectiveness of on-site solar. And so project teams going through the small building process would select one of these applicable to their building type, one of those prescriptive approaches. They're designing to that prescriptive approach, and then looking at pricing out on-site renewable energy, looking at that as it relates to the 12-year payback, and then implementing that if cost effective. If not cost effective, then stepping and looking at offsite resources. If you have a small building and a larger portfolio, then you would be in discussion of what other renewable energy resources are you putting into your portfolio that would offset this additional demand that the building is creating. Projects that are one-offs, don't have portfolios that they're working with, would then step to renewable energy procurement, where you'd be purchasing either combined renewable energy products. So this would be like the Excel's, I'm blanking on Excel's name. WindSource was one of them that included RECs. You could also buy unbundled RECs from the national REC market, which essentially is the ability to claim that you're procuring renewable energy, that you are sourcing your energy from renewable sources. And so you need to do that to the extent needed to meet your target. This does not require projects to run an energy model. You do need to set your energy target in the energy standard tool, the thing you're seeing on the right, where you input your broad space asset areas, and it develops a customized benchmark for the space asset areas that you've input. Space asset areas are our basic programmatic building blocks and areas that include things like corridors and mechanical rooms in them. There are some limitations to this approach. I think that's on the next slide. If you're going above the standard, if you're implementing more aggressive energy conservation measures than are listed in the selected standard, this wouldn't let you essentially take credit for those. You'd still, we're taking kind of a worst case scenario when we evaluate how much renewable energy do you need to find either on-site or off-site oh, sorry, go back. We're taking a worst case scenario approach when we did our modeling evaluation of the comparison between these prescriptive approaches and the 2030 target. So project teams, even if they're under this 20,000 square foot threshold, might still select a model to take credit for, if you're ground coupling your building or doing a more aggressive energy conservation measure, because that will let you take credit for that, and that will lower your need to either implement renewables or procure renewable energy. I'll pause here for questions and pick up a couple we had in the chat. One was mechanical rooms. Whether those are contributing to the 20,000 square foot space. It's not one we've discussed directly, I don't think.
Pat, I think that was it in the chat so far.
We had a small roof we've seen for being cost-effective solar. I've seen a couple on very small projects, although I will admit that they may have like a 3,000 square foot building. But my memory is failing me whether those were cost-effective or whether they were looking to bump up their solar so they could build so they could meet SB 2030 with more on the solar side and less on the efficiency side. I believe that may have been the case. We've seen 12, 15,000 square foot buildings coming in with very close to the threshold of cost effectiveness. So this is, there is I would alert design teams to just be aware that solar is, as it breaks through that cost-effective barrier, will be needed to be implemented more regularly on SB 2030 projects. There's also some, just flagging this because it's a complex issue. There's some complexity to project teams that may want to take or access utility solar incentive programs, and we do permit that, but there's some arbitrage of some of the different crediting of that should be highlighted early as in the planning process. Okay, yeah, I think we can move on unless there's other questions. I see there's some in the chat. Oh yeah, there was a total number of square foot. Sorry, the question is, does the total square foot of the building include exterior walls? The assumption would be no. We do everything with gross square footage, so that does actually include it goes to the exterior skin of the building.
That's an ANSI standard, I think, ASHRAE standard.
There was a question about standalone unheated storage building with no occupancy. Is that less than 20,000 square feet? Does that equal no B3, no SB 2030? That would be less than 20,000 square feet, but even at zero for a building that's a building under code, which is one of the triggering, one of the bits of the triggering language for the program would need to meet B3. So much of that though would drop, much of the B3 guidelines would drop out because you don't have all the portions that are relative to occupied space would drop out. There still would be an energy target, but that'd be pretty minimal in terms of what would be asked for. So the 20,000 square feet is whether it can go into small buildings or not whether it could, it drops out entirely.
Okay, thanks, Pat. If there are no more questions, we'll go now into kind of an overview of the B3 small buildings method. And I'm going to run through a series of charts like this that highlight the different sections of the guidelines. And I'm not going to cover everything extensively, but I just want to make people aware of the fact that this chart will exist in some form or another for easy reference, so that you don't have to scroll through all the guideline text or anything like that to figure out, what's in or out for the small buildings. you can reference this chart, and that will provide you kind of an easier path. So this is a look at the performance management guidelines. There's two guidelines, P1 and P2. I should say that these charts show the full suite of guidelines, and then they show what's happening for the small buildings method within. So over on the left-hand side, you'll see some boxes that say no change or not required or simplified, and those are kind of color-coded in 3 different shades of gray. So that gives you an indication of what has happened to each one of those guidelines within the small buildings method. So for P1, for example, you'll see that each one of those sub-guidelines has been simplified. Within P2, the energy efficient operations manual was already not required for small buildings. So that one is noted as not required. And the post-occupancy evaluation, there's no change there, but we wanted to note that buildings with less than 25 occupants are currently exempt. So that may put a small building outside of that guideline. In addition, POEs are only available right now for a subset of building types. So let's see. Within the P1 guideline, there were some simplifications where we decided to group some of these guidelines into templates. So the OPR document and the basis of design document, those are both documents that are still required for the small buildings approach, but they've now been grouped together in the same template. Similarly, the safety risk assessment for occupied buildings under construction, that kind of IAQ assessment and management plan will be grouped with the other IAQ management plans, the construction and the warranty period air quality management plan. So all those IAQ plans will be in the same template. I can also note that some of the construction IAQ plan, which was broken down into kind of a number of different items that needed to be monitored, and those are listed there on the right-hand side in the right column. Some of those have been dropped out for small buildings to kind of ease the burden of administration for that. In the site and water guidelines, as Pat discussed, the first 4 site and water guidelines, which really deal with the larger site outside of the building, vegetation and soil and that kind of thing, those will all be updated separately when in 2022. Actually, that process is starting now, but that's going to be a small sites update. Within S5, which is the animal habitat support guideline, people primarily know this guideline as the bird safety guideline. That saw some major changes. So we heard a lot of, we got a lot of responses saying it's a lot of calculations, a lot of different things to track. We wanted to reduce the burden there. So essentially what's been done is the first, what is that, 5, 6 calculations involving these different types of threat factors and risk surfaces and traps and things have been simplified down to one calculation. There's a new guideline, new sub-guideline added, S50, which is specifically for small buildings. And it asks you to make one calculation in replacement of all these others. And that's for the average, that's what we're calling an average glazing threat factor. But it's important to note that this path, so to speak, can only be used if the larger building, if the building does not have any traps, quote unquote traps. So again, traps are any kind of see-through condition where a bird might be able to see through a window to an exterior on the other side. So that might be like a glazed railing. It could be a glazed corner in the building, or kind of like a skyway type situation with glass on both sides. So If you can design the building without those quote unquote traps, then you're allowed to use this simplified approach and make an average glazing threat factor calculation for S50. Pat will be talking about this in more detail later, right? I think you will.
Yes, there was a question that came up in the chat that I flagged but didn't. There's a question around for the POEs and the 25 occupants. Generally, we have pursued one or two projects that were exception to this rule. We wouldn't do a POE for a building that had 25 occupants or less for a specific supported space type. And that's so if you have like 25 or less employees working in an area, if you have 25 or less folks that live in a dorm, we're unlikely to get adequate responses to get a good signal back essentially from that process. And so we would exempt them. Just broadly, POEs, we budget for a handful of those every year, and we reach out to those projects that our understanding of them is that they're large enough and they were likely to have enough occupants and they're in a supported building type. So this is much more on us to go out and work through those available buildings than it is a design team burden. There's some need to connect with the folks at the on site that will help us connect to the occupants or the users, but it's mostly on us to run the POEs. And just one other note on POEs, we've got libraries coming online next year as another instrument, and those are library user surveys, not library employees. So we're able to then survey how folks are liking the libraries that some of you have been designing in Minnesota.
All right, thanks, Pat. So within the energy and atmosphere guidelines, there's not a lot of changes to this section. Of course, as we've been discussing, small buildings can use this SB 2030 small buildings method, updated for the 80% reduction in lieu of kind of full-on energy modeling. Let's see. The one thing I can note is that the sub-metering requirements have been dropped out for small buildings. Unless those are required by code, and I know that code change is coming or perhaps already here. I don't know. Do you know, Pat? I think that was we adopted some language in preparation for that. So there may still be code requirements there.
I think that's still in the technical advisory group, but
okay.
But I'm not sure.
Let's see. We're going to be talking more about the renewable energy guideline coming up, but there's not a lot of changes there. Let's see. I think I will go on to the next section. Okay, so the indoor environmental quality, there's actually 2 pages of this. It's by far the largest section of the guidelines. There's also a lot of work. We got a lot of comments back for various guidelines within the section about the amount of work some of these required the administration. So right off the bat, I1A, the interior materials, kind of what we're calling the green certifications for these interior materials. Before, you were required to provide certifications for all of the interior materials unless they met certain requirements or restrictions. Now we're only requiring that for the top 5 interior materials by surface area. So hopefully that reduces the burden there quite a bit. Also in I4B, there was a requirement for documentation of ASHRAE 55 compliance, and that's been dropped out. The other major change I can note here was in the moisture and water control section, I2, where we had in a couple of the most recent guideline versions adopted these qualitative and quantitative moisture analysis. And we've been getting questions from design teams on those guidelines. That usually involves WUFI analysis or Glaser analysis, along with kind of a qualitative moisture analysis of enclosure assemblies. And that section of I2 has been dropped out for small buildings, although we do still strongly recommend that if a small building is pursuing kind of a high R value roof or high R value wall, that they would still be a good idea to do some WUFI modeling, or at least Glaser analysis to check out those assemblies and make sure that those newer high R value assemblies are going to be moisture safe. But right now that is just a recommendation. Okay, second page of indoor environmental quality. There's been some major changes to the lighting and the daylighting guidelines. And we will talk more about that coming up as well. There was a lot of calculations and daylight modeling that we felt like small building teams may not have the resources or the budget to handle. So we tried to find some paths for that that would still achieve acceptable access to daylight within these buildings, but not require the amount of simulations and calculations. Let's see, kind of the same story here for effective acoustics. There was a lot of calculations there, and Pat will discuss how those have been kind of reduced down to a core set that we hope will preserve most of the benefits but reduce some of the workload. I think that's all I wanted to talk about on that slide. For the materials and waste section, another large guideline that we've received a lot of comments on in the past has been whole building life cycle assessment. So that has been a requirement to do a whole building LCA model for quite some time, though it's quite time intensive. And what we're proposing, or what we've adopted, I should say, for the small buildings method is an easier path to demonstrate compliance using the material selection calculator, impact calculator. And that's actually an existing calculator. It's an existing path within this guideline. But for full buildings, you still, even if you use that guideline, you still had to perform a whole building LCA at the end of the show. So that has been dropped off, and now you can just use this calculator as long as you can meet the target. And actually the target has been adjusted, bumped up a little bit to make it a little bit easier for small buildings to meet. If you can't meet that target, as Pat has discussed, you can always go back to the full guideline set and use a whole building LCA model to demonstrate compliance. Another one of these documentation credits. Oh, Pat, were you going to say something?
I was going to just note that it was noted in the Q&A that the document that was posted has a February date that is a typo. This was one that reflects the current status of the guidelines. Apologies for missing that that revision date at the top of that. I'll fix that sometime today, but it's the current version.
All right, so the environmentally preferable materials was another one of these guidelines that required a lot of documentation on the part of the design team. Basically for the total set of materials in the project. And now that has been reduced to only the most prevalent 5. So hopefully that will reduce the burden there. And that's the salvaged, recycled, bio-based, regional, or responsibly sourced credit. Let's see. All right, so just in kind of summary here, the major workload reduction areas we wanted to highlight. Within the performance management section, We've scaled back commissioning to just the HVAC and lighting systems. Within the site and water guidelines, the bird safety guidelines have been scaled back to this single average glazing threat factor calculation, as long as you can demonstrate that there are no see-through conditions in the building. For the energy and atmosphere guidelines, the SB 2030 small buildings method prescriptive approach is allowable. So there's hopefully no or minimal energy modeling there. And we've also dropped the sub-metering requirements. For the indoor environmental quality guidelines, now the green certifications for indoor materials are only required for the top 5 by surface area. There's no moisture performance analysis for enclosure assemblies, i.e. no WFI modeling, glazer analysis, or qualitative moisture analysis.
Although it's recommended.
Unless, right. There's, okay, no IES light level calculations or contrast ratio calculations. And daylight simulations can be replaced by window to wall area ratio requirements. That's one of those we'll go into a deeper dive in a little bit. And again, in lieu of that window to wall area ratio, design teams certainly can take advantage of daylight simulations if they would wish. And finally, acoustics calculations have been simplified. Then in the materials and waste guidelines section, the whole building LCA models are not necessarily required anymore. They can be replaced by the material selection impact calculator. And there's no longer any product level life cycle assessment documentation required. That is the collection of the EPDs. That was the second part of that kind of life cycle analysis guideline. And the environmentally preferable materials tracking is now only required for the top 5 materials. So i.e. 55% of just the top 5 materials rather than the total building materials must now fit in one of these categories of salvaged, reused, or recycled content, bio-based, responsibly sourced, or regional. All right, so that kind of wraps up this overview section. Pat, are you seeing any questions on this?
No, but I did fix that revision summary date issue. So the one that you can download right now should show the correct March update. But no, I don't see anything in the chat. Oh, there was one question about was the building target determined? I'm not positive where which one that's referring to. Which guideline? Is that referring to SB 2030?
Okay, well, we could come back to that one.
Yeah.
Oh, something happened. Okay, regarding the material selection.
Oh, what is the new target for the, yeah, is it still 1.5? It was 1.6, right? Am I misremembering?
It was 1.6, and we've settled on basically 1.75. So that will be updated in the calculator shortly.
So that was one question. I think that just to go back a step, how was that originally determined? How was that building target settled on? I remember there was a lot of Athena evaluation being done, but I forget what the specific methodology was. Broadly, we were looking at how could we verify that a project team, if they had already decarbonized their basic building material selection, how could we give them credit for that without having them essentially document a worse building than they would design to get that bump? Because when we looked into the LCA, how to prove out LCA improvement, some firms had already done that work. Some firms had already gone through and said, okay, well, how can we use mineral wool instead of XPS, for example. And that, we want to make sure that we're both benefiting those teams that are making this transition into a lower carbon material selection and those that already had. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's right. So, because a lot of the problem was, if you're doing a whole building LCA, what are you using as the baseline? And if you've already got a great design that minimizes carbon as your baseline, then it's pretty hard to demonstrate an improvement over that. So the material selection calculator was kind of a path to do that more easily. And the 1.6 number was selected to basically allow kind of more or less a conventional construction type to pass, as long as low carbon materials were selected for insulation and cladding and roofing. That was kind of the general strategy of the 1.6. The 1.75 has been adjusted, or the small buildings guideline has been adjusted up from that to 1.75, just to allow a little bit more flexibility for small buildings. Okay, so we're going to go into the deep dive section now. We've got about let's say half an hour. It's got half an hour left. It goes to 11:30. To discuss these, this first deep dive, P1A and P1C. These are the owner's project requirements and basis of design documents. So not too much to cover here actually, but for small buildings, these documents are still required. But as I mentioned, there's a new template now that is going to combine these two and give kind of an overview, or a structure, I should say, following ASHRAE Standard 202, for people to input the different kind of writing sections. Basically, the OPR, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this already, but basically the OPR is kind of laying out the key requirements for the building's design. It's written generally by the building owner, the building owner's rep. It says what this building is needed or intended to do. And that, of course, happens early on in the design process. That's a pre-design phase submittal. Then the BOD switches over, comes in after that in the design and final design phases, and it's a design team response. It's describes the design of the project and how that project will, in fact, meet the requirements laid out in the OPR. In summary, there is a new template that provides kind of a structure for drafting these two. Let's see, Pat, I think you're next.
Yep. So for bird safety, I'll spend a minute on this and then just pause if there's questions. This is the full guidelines previously, and this, we trimmed down the total number of site and water guidelines. So each one of them has more sub guidelines in them, which is why there's a lot of stuff in here. And so we're looking at the full scope version of the guidelines, looks at whole building threat factor, non-enclosure threat factor, looking at specifically high-risk surfaces, looking at those see-through conditions, the short see-through conditions, the 20 feet, and doing lights out management first year monitoring. So we're dropping all of that out and backstopping that with an average glazing threat factor if you don't have any traps present in your project. And so this does provide a bit more operational ease because you're not having to do that initial monitoring. And the way we landed on this was to run a bunch of different square footage, run a bunch of just through our calculator and looking at where that threshold of pass fail is for these various categories. And so replacing these 6 sections, again, if you don't have any traps in your project, with just a window to wall ratio to threat factor table. And so I think that's on the next slide. Oh, sorry. We also
you want to talk about that though?
Yeah, I'll talk about the critical sites. So we also updated with the critical sites definition. We had initially had a combined critical sites definition that looked at sites that were less desirable to build on. It was kind of conflated with the ones that were higher risk for birds. We split those apart to just look at, okay, well, if we are going to ask for a higher threshold of performance relative to bird impact reduction, where specifically should we be targeting? And the criteria that we came up with was looking at parklands primarily, then Audubon, Minnesota, or Audubon, National Audubon has listed in Minnesota important bird areas, which is a good, quick way to look at potentially higher impact areas. And then because we're also picking up this National Historic, the NHIS from the DNR, picking up that as an area to note for higher bird importance. So that critical sites definition tells you whether you're on the right or left column of the following table. So if you're not in a critical bird area and you have a low window to wall ratio, you can put clear glass in. The higher the window to wall ratio, the more threat factor reduction on average you'll need to implement. Noting here that we're looking at the average glazing threat factor. So this does allow some windows to be clear if other ones are more heavily bird safed. Ideally, you've got a pretty similar application of bird safing across the building, although for this calculation, we do take a prorated or an average approach. So this pretty quickly will let project teams say, well, I've got this window to wall ratio and here's my maximum threat factor. And then you know how much glazing you have. So it's determining, okay, how much glazing do you have plus threat factor of each individual portion of that glazing. So there is a little calculation involved with this, but it's less of a, we view this as less of a burden than the existing bird safe requirement. And also to note that we have a specific legislative requirement to implement bird safety in the B3 guidelines program. So it's one that we felt like we, in addition to the benefit to the birds themselves, we felt like something we had to, we needed to hold on to deliberately. I'll make a couple notes on threat factor for those of you that have gone through this discussion. Reach out to me if you've got questions about a non-rated frit pattern or a non-rated glazing technology. We've done some estimates of where those fit relative to those tested products, and so I've provided estimates for those novel frits or novel approaches. And then we're seeing more films and exterior applied products coming online. There's a couple of name brands out there, but they seem to be fairly equivalent in terms of what they're producing. Though there's considerations for them around durability, how many years they last. These are just out of the gate right now, so we don't have 10, 20 years of data on whether they needed to be replaced or not. It does increase the amount of the flexibility of glazing options available for projects. So you can use an off-the-shelf product and then apply a film on that, or apply a dot pattern on that. And also you're getting, for the same visibility differential, for the same amount of obstruction, the same amount of coverage, you're going to get a lower threat factor for an exterior applied product, because the birds can basically see things on the exterior of glazing better than they can see things on surface too. Questions? I think there's a couple that popped up in the chat. There is a question that's about the environmental preferred materials. I'll pick that up when we go to the deep dive in that. There's a question about, does this calculation take into account tinted glass versus clear glass? Yes, there's different threat factors for different glazing. So it depends on what level of tint that you have. Tinted though is not as impactful as fritting in terms of lowering the threat factor.
Okay, I might go on to the renewable energy. That's okay, Pat.
Yeah.
The E2 credit, renewable energy. There are basically two parts to this. There's E2A, which is commonly known as the 2% on-site renewables. There's also E2B, which is the solar ready, or what we should technically probably say renewable energy ready site or roof. And so E2A, the guideline there is, the requirement there is to supply 2% of the project's total energy consumption with on-site renewables. Doesn't have to be solar, it could be solar PV, it could be solar thermal, it could be wind. Geothermal is not currently allowed. And this, as many of you probably know by now, this guideline is a specific separate state statute that is picked up in the B3 guidelines. It operates independently of, somewhat independently of the SB 2030 renewable energy options. But any renewables that are added to meet this 2% requirement can of course contribute towards meeting the SB 2030 target. But it is separate in the sense that even if an analysis shows that renewable energy is not cost effective on site for the SB 2030, it may still come back as cost effective or required for this 2% credit. And that's because that determination is a different process. So that's the final bullet point there. The standard SB 2030 12-year payback does not apply to the 2% on-site renewables.
And this is derived from there being different language that points
Yeah.
to 2% and that points to SB 2030.
Right, it's a different statute that governs that. So in this statute, the installation of solar is really triggered by this cost comparison. But the cost comparison is not a simple payback approach. It's a levelized cost comparison. So we've developed this LCOE calculator, levelized cost of energy calculator, which basically is designed to follow the statute language, and it compares the price of the utility derived electricity that your building might be plugged into, plus the social cost of carbon, and compares that cost to the levelized cost of on-site renewables, plus whatever money is being spent on their maintenance or financing. So it's kind of like this balancing act. And if the levelized cost of the on-site renewables comes back less than the cost of the grid energy plus the social cost of carbon, then you are required to go ahead with the on-site renewables. So this is a look here on the right side, a look at the calculator, a page from the calculator. There's two different calculators. One is used in the pre-design phase. One is used in the design phase. And in the pre-design phase, there is a value that is actually given for you, an estimated installation cost. The only real lever to pull here is what is your expected electricity or gas costs for the utility delivered energy costs. You enter those, and because the installation cost is a given, it performs this kind of balancing calculation for you. And down at the bottom it says yes or no, and right here this one is showing in the green box yes. This is that installation cost per megawatt hour that's a given for you has been adjusted upward for small buildings to reflect the fact that there's going to be smaller arrays or smaller wind turbines or what have you, and those typically cost more per megawatt hour than a larger array. So that number has been adjusted. What that means is you're more likely to be stopped at this during the pre-design phase and say, no, actually installation is not required. But if after you've entered your utility costs and you get an answer back that says, yes, the renewables is likely going to be less than the cost of grid energy plus the social cost of carbon, then you continue and you drop down into the next phase during the design phase of the building and you use the design phase LCOE calculator. So that one requires you to go out and get an actual bid from a contractor, and you put that number in there where previously it wasn't estimated for you. So then it redoes that calculation. And if it says no, according to the contractor bid, the levelized cost of renewables on site is going to be higher, then again, you're stopped and you don't have to pursue the renewables option. But if it comes back less than the cost of grid energy plus the social cost of carbon, then that's when installation is triggered. So this is a kind of a chart that shows that process, hopefully, because we've gotten some questions on that. Let's see, hopefully I described that adequately. Is there any questions coming in? I don't see any. Okay, so E2B, that's the renewable energy ready roof or site. So for the full guidelines, really, there is priority placed on renewable ready roofs. And you are not allowed to go with a renewable ready site unless there's some specific constraints that are limiting the use of the roof. Those could be shading on the building's rooftop, could be local ordinances restricting the use of building rooftops or solar on the building, that kind of thing. So in the full guidelines, there's really this priority placed on solar ready roofs. In reflecting on that, especially for small buildings, we wanted to make that path a little bit easier and open it up to renewable ready site because it is typically going to be a cheaper option than renewable ready roofs. But of course it uses more, land area. So that was kind of a balancing act. But the small buildings guideline now allows you to use a site without necessarily having a shaded roof or something like that. So the renewable ready site requirements, just to review, you still have to meet these requirements to prove that your site is quote unquote renewable ready. So that means a designated clear area that has unobstructed wind or solar access and is outside of planned expansion areas for the building. There has to be stub outs or even better, buried conduit to the designated areas on the site. There has to be a conveniently located accessible indoor space within the building that's reserved for installation of controls and other equipment that's needed for renewable energy. There's a site plan that needs to be developed that lays this out and identifies those locations. And then you need to verify that the local zoning regulations are going to permit the construction and use of renewable energy on the site. So I think I will pause there and see if there's any questions on E2.
There's a question around, is there any location factors for the 2% installation costs? Remote versus outstate. Sorry, in-state versus outstate. No, but that would be picked up at that second phase where if you pass the first gate and actually ask, what would this cost to implement? We picked up at that second step at that design phase.
Yeah, I'm assuming that question is referring to costs, and there isn't an adjustment for location, but that would, as Pat said, definitely be picked up when you go to the design phase calculator and you're obtaining contractor bids.
Just in the interest of time, we were going to step pretty quickly through the other deep dives.
Okay.
So there was a question around how does SB 2030 apply to projects involving no remodeling of space, but major MVP renovation and replacements. We as you're onboarding a project in B3, if you have limited renovations, there's a discussion around what the scope of the project are and what the scope of the guidelines is, and we match the guideline scope to the project scope in terms of relevant guidelines. So if you're doing an interior only renovation, for example, we would drop out the site and water requirements because it's unrelated to the project that you're pursuing. So that similar approach is taken if you've got a more limited interior renovation, which has been more, enclosure or mechanical work.
Pat, did you see this question about green roofs?
I did.
In the chat.
We don't have a green roof requirement per se. It can contribute to some of the animal habitat and other items, but we don't have a hard and fast thou shalt green roof.
Yeah, I think that would really be up to the design team whether or not they want to pursue that versus a solar ready roof, but it wouldn't be technically required.
Yep. All right, I'm going to go pretty quickly. This just a note: low emitting materials. If you want to go to the next slide, we drop this down to only the 5 most prevalent by surface area, and so that's looking for certification of low VOC, low off gassing per CDHP. We're still keeping the wet applied materials because that's really the heavy hitter for where you're likely to see VOC loading into buildings. Rolf, lighting.
Okay, daylighting. The full guidelines required some calculations around the IES lighting levels and contrast levels. They also required daylight modeling. And you are allowed to select one of these 3 different paths, either this spatial daylight autonomy, the luminance level, or the daylight factor path to demonstrate compliance. So those first 2 have been dropped for small buildings, and the third, I5C, can be replaced by meeting a window to wall area ratio of 40%. And that is calculated for all regularly occupied spaces that are located at the perimeter of the building, and it's an average. So you could have some spaces that have less than 40%. You could have some spaces along the perimeter that are more than 40%, but the average needs to be 40%. Also, to maintain a high level of daylight, the glazing in those spaces must have a VT greater than 0.65. That's visible transmittance. So our team is also considering right now, it's kind of a late addition under consideration, adopting a window to floor area ratio benchmark. We don't have a percentage for that yet, but it will be coming. And that's just to help design teams that may have kind of a deeper building footprint where window.
It also picks up skylights.
And skylights, yep. Okay, so I7B, which requires access to vision glazing, is still required for small buildings. So I7 really is designed to work in tandem with I5C, now the window to wall area ratio, to ensure that most of the regularly occupied space has access to daylight. We wouldn't want to see a situation where all the regularly occupied space is in the middle of the building and has no access to daylight. So that those 2 guidelines are working together to ensure that.
We're planning on looking at the impacts of window overhangs. That is one area that you could see lower daylighting if you've got a heavily shaded window to wall ratio at 40% that we're just not picking up with this level of detail. It'd be picked up for larger buildings that you're using the daylight model, certainly, but not these smaller projects.
Okay, acoustics.
So acoustics. So there's a divergence in the path where education facilities, including higher ed, would use I6A, and then we've essentially used the similar types of sections that exist in that ANSI standard to pick up those acoustic criteria for non-education buildings. But for smaller buildings, Ralph, you want to go to the next slide, we're dropping out the exterior noise control, which I know going out and getting or determining OITC ratings has been a burden for some project teams. And just sliding this back to just looking at SCC requirements for interior walls, and then a reverberation time or area weighted, sorry, that should not be area weighted STC, that should be an NRC, area weighted NRC, so noise reduction criteria. So if you, we have I6D, the acoustic conditions of gathering spaces for the hard of hearing, is a separate legislative add. So we picked it up here. So there's some, that's around having ability to have an audio induction loop access. And then I7E is only if you've not met other criteria. So implementing sound masking if you've not adequately done your other noise control sections. This is the STC rating. We're looking at different occupancy classes, and then making sure that your impact isolation class for relative sleeping areas is met, and then making sure that if you've got mechanical rooms that you're adequately isolating those. And again, I'm going to go through these pretty quickly because I know we are running low on time. I think you can go to the next slide. I think it's, yep, and then acoustic criteria. The reverb time is still there. One thing that got noted heavily when we did a pass through our previous POEs is that the acoustic environment is one of the lowest scoring ones. And I think there's several different factors for that, but it's one area that we wanted to retain both on the larger guidelines and then to the extent feasible here, because it's noted as a significant contributing factor to the comfort of the occupants. We are using a reverb time, and then if you're getting a larger space and it's more difficult to hit the reverb time, the backstop there is likely where the NRC, the area weighted NRC comes into calculation. So that's just looking at what is the NRC of each individual material in the space, and then weighting that by area and getting under or getting above a 0.45 or 0.35 if it's a smaller space. Questions? I'll see if there's any listed in the chat currently. It does not look like it, so I think we should proceed. M2A, at least 55% of the total building materials used in the project must have one of the following attributes. And this is the guideline that scores the number of contributing attributes can be multiplied by the contributing percentage. If you want to hop to the next, we're now looking at the top 5 materials by mass, by cost, or by volume. Likely, if you're not doing a whole building LCA, you don't have the mass or volume number. If you do, if you are doing a tally or other roll up, you do have that. So it's likely cost is how this will be used. We're looking for the 5 most prevalent by the criteria that you're listing. So it could be the 5 most costly materials. It could be the 5 heaviest materials, etc. So, but just for the 5. And then if you flip to the next slide, it's important to note, looking at the listing those materials, and then you're looking for a 55% of the sum of the total quantity for those top 5 materials. So the note at the top, the total quantity, we're actually looking for the quantity of the top 5. Let's just say the top 5 materials cost $1 million in a project. You would type in $1 million to that total quantity. And we'll update this calculator to reflect that, because if you didn't make that adjustment, if you just kept the total material cost of the entire project and only looked at the top 5, it'd be much more difficult to meet it. So I think that picks up the question that was in the chat. You're looking at just the cost, volume, mass of those top materials that you're selecting. You can add more if you need to get to that 55% threshold, but you need to add them in sequence. You need to add the 6th, the 7th, the 8th, the 9th if you want to access the 10th. It's the 10th that's going to be contributing to your compliance.
Right. No cherry picking, right, Pat?
Yep. Yep. Bio-based. There's a couple of definitions buried in the guideline text around. I think USDA's got a definition for bio-based that we piggyback on, and we're aligning that with bio-based as it worked under. I think it was a 2015 edition of the IGCC, if I remember correctly.
Okay, I think really that's it. So are there any last questions here? We've got a few minutes left at the end. We can try and address those if you want to type them in.
There was a question in the chat about for M2A, what cost to use. It's material cost only. It's not, we're not including installation costs, labor, overhead. It's just the material, the bare material cost. There's a question in the chat for new to B3. Is there a good introductory resource to review? I suggest if you're getting started with a B3 project, it's been very useful to have at least a half-hour sit down, potentially longer. Once the design team has had a chance to look through the guidelines, had their tracking tools set up, just to have a discussion about what we'll be looking for, and then the process of submitting and moving forward through the program. We are also mid writing of a couple of additional guidance documents, particularly around things like variances and agency contact roles that'll be coming out in the next handful of months.
Right, and again, this presentation will be uploaded. So if you want to go back to refer to it, it will be uploaded as a video on our training page. So you can always go back to that as a reference.
Oh yeah, and Liz dropped in the chat the training page.
Yes.
All right, if there's no more questions, I'm keeping an eye on this. We will follow up with, we'll push this to AIA for those that have AIA credits. For other folks, if you give us a day or so, you'll get a certificate of completion that we pull from the attendee list. I know for the engineers and others that's the useful way of getting their certification credits. If still after that you're looking for documentation of attendance, let me know, and we can move back to that. Oh, we have an AIA in the chat, Liz. But great. Well, thanks everybody for attending, and we'll see folks out in the wild. Thanks, Rolf. Thanks, Liz.